Hi there, welcome to this Clip Studio Paint tutorial, where I'm going to show you how I paint skies for backgrounds using Clip Studio Paint and some assets in Clip Studio Assets, as well as how to light different scenes with natural lighting outdoors. I'll be sharing general principles regarding light, color, and how I generally use Clip Studio to paint the illustrations you see here. All the assets used to create the skies you see here are listed down in the description. Generally, you want two key assets: a gradient set called Skies 2 and cloud brushes. Let's start with my favorite kind of weather, the overcast sky. The overcast sky happens when there's a thin layer of clouds covering the sky and the sun's light is diffused and indirect. The sky appears light gray or white, and there's no sharp demarcation between light and shadow. We'll be using a gray sky for the background. I tend to start with grayscale in order to make use of the gradient maps. First, you'll want to layer things up like how the sky would be like in real life. So in an overcast type of weather, the sky is mainly this light gray color. I then start to create layers upon layers of clouds. This sets up the ability for us to do the neat things like projecting light through the clouds, over the clouds, and we can easily create the illusion of distance and height as well. I wouldn't worry about the colors of the clouds just yet, as long as they're close to the values that I have in my mind. The gradient map and other correction layers will help us to adjust the values later on. Once we're happy with the initial layers, we can apply a gradient map correction layer. I've already got the gradient maps I need loaded here. I then select a gradient map named Overcast, and everything underneath the correction layer will be affected by this gradient map. What the gradient map actually does is it takes the grayscale values and assigns them the color that is used in the gradient map. And like any layer, we can adjust the opacity of the correction layer to adjust how much of an effect it has. Right now, this overcast gradient map is too blue for my taste, so I am taking the opacity down a notch. As I've said earlier, we can make adjustments to each individual cloud layers and even paint on them. Locking the transparency of individual layers allows us to paint on the clouds. So using the cloud brush, we can paint some highlights on our clouds as well as some shadows, and even some lighting that's peering through in between the clouds. Let's say you already have a character or landscape that already has the local base colors already loaded in, like what I have here. I won't go in depth with how I would go about painting the character, but I'll share some general guidelines to painting them under certain weather conditions. It'll be easier for us in the long run to keep these elements of the scene in separate layers like what I have here. It makes it a whole lot easier to create adjustments per elements later on. Generally, for an overcast sky, the lighting is very diffuse. The light source is the entire sky. The sun isn't visible, and the light is being diffused by a thin layer of clouds in the atmosphere, and thus, almost everything on the ground is lit equally from all sides, with light bouncing almost off everything, producing shadow only in the deepest crevices or in areas that are closer to each other. The neutrally colored diffuse lighting from the sky will illuminate everything, and most of the base colors of the objects will be very clear, because the light of the color is neutral gray. Some cameras can adjust the temperature and make things slightly warmer or cooler. Under overcast lighting, shadows are often soft and appear sparingly. I often just paint them in the nooks and crannies where I think the least light would reach. It's usually when two surfaces are very close to one another. Remember that light bounces multiple times, so even surfaces facing the ground are going to be lit. Personally, I think painting some skies and weather settings is actually tricky to pull off effectively, mainly because our eyes, as well as some cameras with dynamic exposure, automatically adjust the size of their apertures to control the amount of light coming in. If you try looking up in the overcast sky, then look at objects on the ground, you'll notice that some objects are actually significantly darker than the sky. And if you use a video recorder, the same is true when you point up to the sky and then point down towards the horizon. The footage becomes over and underexposed while the camera is adjusting to the light. This is why I advise to constantly look at the entire scene after you've done zooming in and painting. Usually you'll need to adjust the values of the elements in the scene for it to look more cohesive. Now, I'm gonna show you how I would go about painting the skies of a clear day. When there is little to no clouds in the sky, you get an entirely vibrant and blue sky. And its looks varies depending on your vantage point, the camera settings, the time of day, and the amount of clouds in the sky. For the clear sky, I usually start with 3 value points. As a rule of thumb, the sky will gradually lose its bluish color the closer it is towards the horizon. You can look at some photos to verify this. And depending on the density of the clouds, it also loses a bit of blueness as it gets nearer to the sun. Or at least where the sun is in the sky. For this example, I wanted to indicate that the sun was somewhere overhead, so the values there are slightly lighter. Once I'm clear on the separations I established, I do a blend or a blur mode blend between the values and apply the cloudless gradient map to it. It seems like my values don't utilize the gradient map that well at the moment, so I apply a tonal correction to darken some of the values in the grayscale and to lighten some values as well. Basically, the tonal control ends up controlling the values of the layers it affects. This often happens when you're using a gradient map and you need to adjust the values of the grayscale you just painted on. So here's a quick section on how to use the tonal curve and level adjustment. So as you can see right now, the top left is set to RGB. This controls all the red, green, blue channels at the same time. In the x-axis, we have the input, and adjusting the curve adjusts the output. We're setting the output based on the input. I love how Clip Studio Paint displays the tonal correction menu. As you can see, there are labels and numerical values on the graph, as well as an overlay of the existing amounts of the values that you're affecting. Right now, you can see that the grayscale I made so far is too bright, and it doesn't have enough of a range to make use of the gradient map effectively. So I set the curve to output a lower y-axis value at the start of the existing values, and a steeper rise as I'm approaching the highest value in my existing grayscale layer. You can also adjust the range of your values using level adjustment by going to Edit Tonal Correction Levels. The left and rightmost ticks are the ends of the existing value range. The middle tone is the mid-range, and you can change the upper and lower ranges by moving the markers. Here, I'm pinching them closer together so that my upper range becomes lighter and my lower range becomes darker, in turn makes better use of the gradient map. And now we proceed to painting the clouds of this clear day. Much like in the Overcast Sky painting, we'll be adding layers upon layers of clouds. I tend to vary the flatness and the size of my clouds to imply a sense of perspective and depth. Clouds in a very clear day can be seen clearly being affected by the sun. In order to do this, I lock the transparency of the layer and start painting directional light and shadow using the cloud brush. I feel like gradients and blurs sometimes cheapen the look of the sky, so I go ahead and add texture to the areas where the value shifts. And there we go, it's a clear day in this painting now, and it's time to go over some tips on how to paint objects in a clear day. So some rules I follow when I'm painting stuff in clear daylighting. Clear daylighting introduces harsh shadows because of the directional light coming directly from the sun, and it also has some bounce light coming off the ground. The shadows aren't exactly the absence of light, but rather these are the areas only being lit by the diffuse bluer light coming from the sky. Thus, I actually light the shadows with a darker value version of the sky color. Lit areas by direct sunlight tend to be a warmer color in this setting, and this varies from time of day. Due to the directional nature of this lighting, you'll see what looks to be harsher shadows everywhere. There's a plane change, and when things are facing away from the sun, or when an object gets in the way of the sun's light. And now we move to what I feel is the trickiest of all lighting setups I had to paint, which is the golden hour, or when the sun is setting. I personally think that the golden hour when the sun is setting is one of the trickiest setups to paint because it is so dynamic and it looks so different minute to minute. It changes really fast, and the temperature of light in the sky varies a lot from sunset to sunset. I start out with the same setup as always with the grayscale layer, where I arrange the values in such a way that I place the sun off camera and one hemisphere of the sky will be lit partially by the sun, producing a purplish color, while the other hemisphere will be a much cooler, darker color, closer to that of the night sky. If you observe the sunset sky, you'll also notice that the horizon is usually much brighter than the rest of the sky as well. Use the cloud brush with different values to add texture to the sky, while placing the values where I think they would usually fall. Among the sky gradients in the pack, I think Epilogue is the closest to where I want the final image to be. It's not exactly what I imagined the sky would look like, but with some additional adjustments later on, I fine-tune the values and the colors as well. As you can see here, I'm having a hard time really finalizing my values for this type of sky, and I really can't seem to finalize the sky just yet. So I use a bit of color balance correction later on because I wanted to control the warmth of the sunlight and how its warmth is affecting the sky. That's turning dark blue for the night. Finally, just to set the mood, I drop another tonal adjustment correction layer on top before I paint the clouds. Afterwards, I make further adjustments to the general sky dome with a soft brush. Similar to the clear sky, the sunset appears heavily directional and shadows are very apparent, even on clouds. So don't hesitate to add dimension and volume to your clouds by painting light and dark values using the cloud brush while keeping the transparency lock on. And basically, the difference between painting in the clear sky and sunset is ultimately the sun's light. It's the same as with the clear sky, that it's very directional, but the sunlight is coming from a different direction now and has a red-orange hue because the sun's light passes through larger parts of the atmosphere across the horizon during the sunset. When you light objects in red-orange light, the color will shift to a warmer color. Objects will become orange with varying warmths and coolness. And I paint orange and red on top of almost anything that's facing the sunset, and paint cool dark purple and blue on the planes that face away from the sun. So some summary and key points when painting the sky using this method. So number 1, use gradient maps to make things easier so that you can focus on the values first, but don't let that limit you. You can apply necessary correction layers and paint overs later on top of the gradient map if necessary. Number 2, I'd advise you paint the clouds in separate layers so that you can paint light in between the clouds as well as add volume to them separately easily. With this, you can also imply depth and distance, and using transparency lock or clipping masks, you can add volume to the clouds separately as well. Number 3, the most important of all key points, I think, would be to observe real-life situations and study how light behaves. And that's it. I hope this tutorial has been of some help at least, and happy painting! By the way, if you have any questions regarding this video or anything related to Clip Studio Paint and art, just leave your questions down in the comment section. And if you have any suggestions, like Youngdo Choi from last week, who suggested that I make a simpler but more in-depth portrait tutorial, I'm actually working on it as we speak. I've already recorded the footage, but I'm not done with the editing yet. But it should come out soon, so stay tuned. Thanks.